Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation, DEI in the Balance. I'm Adi Arguelles Sabatier, Executive Director of the American Anthropological Association, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. I'm joined by Sean Mallon, also from AAA, who will help us moderate the chat for questions. The landscape of diversity, equity, and inclusion has shifted dramatically over the past year. New executive orders introduced a direct challenge to DEI efforts across sectors, and since then, we've seen a wave of legal battles, policy shifts, and organizational responses, some defensive, others proactive. And today, we are here to break it all down. What is happening? How does it affect different areas? And what are the legal and institutional responses? And critically, what comes next? To help us navigate this, we have two leading DEI experts, Dr. Missy Maceyko and Dr. Lucy Arciniega. They are co-founders of Willing Observers, and they bring a deep knowledge of these issues. We're fortunate to have them here today. Thank you so much, Lucy and Missy. Quick note, our section is structured, but we want it to be dynamic. And so you'll hear an overview of current policy landscape, followed by response strategies, actionable steps, and audience Q&A. I encourage you to submit your questions in the chat as we go along throughout the session, and Sean will be moderating the chat and interjecting with questions throughout the presentation. So let's begin with an overview. We know that these executive orders that were signed in January have caused widespread concern. Could you share a little more about your work and your background and walk us through the general landscape? What do these orders do? What's the rationale behind them? How are they being implemented? And how do these orders affect different sectors?
Thank you so much, Addie, for having us here. Just to give a brief overview, we're going to walk through some topics, including we're going to do a brief introduction first. We're going to go over this overview on the executive orders and the impacts they have had on DEI policy and practice across different sectors, higher ed, corporate, nonprofit. Then we're going to talk about strategies, what people can do, what people have been doing, what people can do, and how people can take action. And we'll wrap up with how you can stay informed and do a Q&A. But as you mentioned, Addie, we wanted it to be very interactive. So as we go along through the deck and the presentations, if anyone has any questions, Sean will be reading them. Addie, please feel free to interject, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you.
So a little bit about ourselves. I'll start first. So I have over 10 years of experience in DEI industry. I actually got into this field through my dissertation research when I was a grad student at UC Irvine back in 2011, 2012. And back then, diversity, equity, and inclusion was just diversity and inclusion. And before that, it was just diversity management. So I have written about this both academically and non-academically in public ed. I had a column in Anthropology News from 2017 to 2019 called Diversity at Work. And since then, I've held a number of different roles in the DEI landscape. As you know, anthropologists go native. So I started doing consulting in the DEI space. And I held both volunteer and formal roles at the National Diversity Council. They're no longer an organization that is in operation, but at the time they were one of the biggest nonprofits that did diversity advocacy, and they had branches in over 20 states. And also served as director of DEI at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. And I met Missy when I was faculty at Cal State Long Beach. And after that, I was also at Wayne State University in Detroit as a visiting assistant professor. I'll pass it on to you, Missy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again, Addie, for the introductions, and thanks for having this conversation. So as Lucy mentioned, we met at California State University, Long Beach, which is where I am at right now. I'm in a number of departments, right now primarily political science. And my background and how I got into doing the work is Lucy and I have skill sets that complement one another. And so I came into the space largely through political activism, public policy, advocacy work, particularly around gender equity issues. But I have a strong research background in anthropology, studying democracy and how people talk to each other in a way that makes them feel empowered when they're talking about political issues and talking across difference. And so my research informs the kind of approach that I also take to doing DEI work. So as Lucy mentioned, we both have both academic and popular publications, and we do a lot of public education. I'm also the current director of public policy for the American Association of University Women of California, where I do a lot of work on both writing and advancing gender equity legislation, and giving people tools to do more advocacy. So we founded Willing Observers to kind of center culture in the DEI work and in the DEI space. A lot of DEI work comes out of other disciplines, including psychology. And so Lucy and I wanted to actually really center culture in this work and bring an anthropological approach and lens to the work that we do. So we bring in, of course, business management literature, but we bring in the kind of theoretical backgrounds that we both bring to bear, whether that's linguistics, political science, and anthropology to inform the space. And so we do a lot of public education. We have a lot of free resources that we have listed here. So anything that we talk about today, we probably have a resource for it. And if we don't, please reach out to us because we're always providing free resources. And we have a podcast called the Intracultural podcast. We also do a lot of different kinds of work in DEI space, training, speaking engagements. We do a lot of cultural assessment work and help with strategic planning. And we just launched a certificate program that is SHROOM and HRCI certified for professional development and training and upskilling folks on doing DEI work from a kind of more cultural centered and anthropological approach. So that's a little bit about our background, and I will pass it back off to Lucy to get into the meat of the questions.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So as we all know, I said, yeah, very depressingly. Yeah, let's get into the meat of the questions. So as you know, on January 21, President Trump signed several executive orders that targeted diversity, equity, and inclusion, both generally and specifically. And what Missy and I emphasize all the time, that these are vague, questionable, contradictory. They don't make sense, right? So a lot of these are being held up in federal court, but they have had these chilling effects. And the basic premises of the order is that DEI is quote unquote discriminatory. And part of it is this assumptions about what DEI is, misunderstandings about what DEI work is. But what we know is that their DEI is not discriminatory. And we'll talk a little bit about what attorney generals have said on the matter. What we do know is that DEI is about diversity management, not affirmative action. So this comes with, this is part of the misunderstanding and the targeting of DEI as meritless that people pose and the DEI anti-movement in terms generally, broadly speaking, has posed DEI as something that is not due to merit, that is based on preferential treatment of people of color, of people, women, of people of different sexual orientations, et cetera. And that misunderstanding comes from the fact that DEI is rooted in affirmative action, but has since evolved and become its own separate thing. So how it is practiced, actually, DEI, when it's practiced and applied well, it should not be discriminatory. In fact, it is not discriminatory. Part of what the goals are is to eliminate bias, to make systems more fair, right? To provide opportunities for people that have not had those opportunities historically. But because of the misunderstanding around it and the lack of practice in making sure that things are fair, we have had this tension for a long time in this country, where one part of the problem is that not enough people know how to do DEI and do DEI well. And the other part is that people misunderstand at the core what DEI is. And when I say people don't know what DEI is, and well, that includes the DEI professionals. So we can go into a long conversation about that. But this is a joint statement from 13 attorney generals, and they wrote defense of DEI shortly after it came out. And this was published on January 31st. And so they said President Trump's executive orders are unnecessary and disingenuous. These orders have nothing to do with combating discrimination. The Trump administration has longstanding civil rights laws at its disposal to combat real discrimination, and we would be willing partners if it chose to pursue this path. Instead, the administration is targeting lawful policies and programs that are beneficial to all Americans. These policies and programs are not only consistent with anti-discrimination laws, they foster environments where everyone has an opportunity to succeed, and that is the opposite of discrimination. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight as an example, for instance, within the DEI practice, something that's really common and has been common for the last few years is unconscious bias training. And almost, now when Missy and I have been doing consulting for several years now, part of many companies already have unconscious bias training. They have recorded videos. They have people come speak. So that's been something that has been a foundation for a lot of DEI work, which is how do we mitigate our unconscious biases to make sure that things like hiring processes are fair, things like our mentorship programs are fair, that we're giving everyone the opportunity to succeed across differences. And that's one of the practices that Trump's orders are saying is discriminatory. So again, it doesn't exactly make sense. And at best, these are to create a chilling effect, and it has been really effective in that way.
Yeah. So, why this focus on DEI? As Lucy has been kind of alluding to, right, there is a difference between affirmative action and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity management. But the anti-DEI orders themselves are the result of this kind of, expanding efforts around DEI, both personally, institutionally, organizationally. Since 2020, since the murder of George Floyd, we had this kind of massive, response and reaction, and this expansion around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And anytime you have any sort of movement forward, as we all know, you get subsequent pushback to that kind of movement. So this post-2020 expansion kind of raised awareness around and brought diversity management, or DEI, more squarely into public consciousness and public conversation. And all of this in spite of the fact that diversity management was created in part to depoliticize some social justice efforts in the 1980s, when they were under major political attack. So when affirmative action came under attack in the 1980s, diversity management kind of came into being as a way to continue to do some areas or certain aspects of social justice work and expand it in organizational and business spaces. But all of that is a result to depoliticize some of that work. However, I keep joking that we worked undercover for about 40 years, and then it became politicized again, and post-2020, as social consciousness around this as a concept really started to rise. So although diversity management is historically embedded in large for-profit organizations, under federal anti-discrimination law, DEI focuses not just on compliance, but as I alluded to, not just following the law to not discriminate, but on creating fairness and creating the conditions for everyone to thrive. So anti-discrimination, squarely associated with the law, but pro-DEI and anti-DEI efforts have increasingly played out in the courts anyway. So this map, what you're looking at, shows state level legislation that targets DEI efforts in colleges specifically. The amount of legislation proposed, the range of DEI or anti-DEI focus has been on an uptick since 2020, has expanded exponentially in 2024 and 2025, but these efforts have been ongoing over the past few years. And this is just the efforts focused on colleges. There are other maps that show specific target areas. For instance, the number of anti-LGBTQ plus pieces of legislation that have already been proposed this year tops 500 at the state level. So we see this, right, happening all over the place. Now, how does this affect different sectors? So the orders are, as Lucy said, overly broad and vague. They frame this kind of DEI ideology. They flag programs related to seemingly neutral words or those that appear in the Constitution and census, such as women, Native Americans. The orders problematize the definition of discrimination, and even though they seem to align with historical notions of discrimination as something that applies to marginalized groups. If we look to the reverse racism cases of yore, you see in those cases as well, the idea of discrimination is used as a way to bolster the majority rather than focus on historical marginalization of a minority. But all of this, right, these vague orders have led to massive restructuring, first in federal agencies, which I'm sure that you're all very aware of, the elimination of federal departments, closure of DEI offices, elimination of DEI roles. These were the first two phases that came out of the executive orders. As well as defunding, restructuring, or elimination of DEI-related educational and discrimination enforcement agencies. So the gutting of some agencies, I didn't look this morning, but there's supposed to be an EO about the Department of Education. But even the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education has already been gutted, which means, right, no enforcement. So withdrawal of federal funding projects, programs and departments, anything seen as DEI related based on this kind of flagged words list, and which is something that I'm sure that you have all experienced. And this is culture made its way onto the list as of the last viewing of the flagged words list. So the EOs have more power to control the direction of federal agencies, but they have trickle-down effects to anybody receiving federal funding across industries. Right? This is why researchers have had less leeway for thinking about, right, what they're going to do. And as Lucy has alluded to, it has a massive chilling effect across industries. So we're focusing largely on education as a sector, but it has different challenges for different industries. So we'll focus a little more on how private sector has a little bit more mobility and leeway, but I will pause there to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Missy. I think that the next question that's on my mind is, what if Trump doesn't follow these laws or decisions from judges around discrimination and DEI, and how are people responding, in different ways to navigate this landscape?
I think there's a question in the chat that's related to this. With limited access to non-mainstream media, how do we combat the false notion that DEI is discriminatory within the general public?
Those are really great answers or questions. One of the things is that I wanted to talk about is that people have been responding in very different ways already. And I'll get back to Missy will have a great question, I'm sure, about the answer to the question on what if Trump doesn't actually abide by the law, which, as we have seen, has been the case in numerous situations. But the positive things is that what these questions get at is like, what are we doing or what can we do as a response to these kinds of issues? So we've seen organizations respond very differently. Like some organizations that we work with, for example, have just told us that they're not going to listen to the executive orders. They said, actually, these executive orders make no sense. Their DEI is not discriminatory. We consulted with our attorneys. We're not breaking the law. So we're keeping everything business as usual. And these clients that we've had have just doubled down on even using DEI, like they've recommitted. They've said that we're not even going to talk about belonging. We're going to keep using DEI and reclaim those those terms. And what we've noticed from the clients that have been doing that is that they don't have federal contracts with the government. They're not subcontractors. They really are not depending on the federal funding of the government at all. And they're just concerned with following the law. We've also had companies that have been completely rebranded that have not in order to follow through with the EO on the surface, they've just removed all of their DEI words from their websites, from their programs. They've retitled their employees, roles. For example, instead of being a director of DEI, now they're director of engagement or director of, community empowerment. I saw that one on LinkedIn the other day. So they are rebranding, but not substantially changing any of the work that they're doing. And we also have seen clients that are just delaying doing anything new and just keeping everything as usual, but they're worried to do anything new until they know more. And these kind of different approaches and responses to the executive order, what we've been terming them is like reflects this organizational privilege that institutions might have, right? Some institutions, as you're probably all seeing, those of you that are logged into the webinar, you might come from institutions that are responding in a way that comes out of fear, right? So they're asking, rebranding, taking things down, renaming offices, closing offices, reopening under a different name. Like these certainly come out of a place of fear. And other organizations that and institutions that are being more bold because they know that they are legally protected and that they are willing to, cough up the money and go into a lawsuit with Trump. So if Trump doesn't follow through on what the federal judges says, it's like a lot of his leverage has to do with ability to provide funding, right, to these institutions and these organizations to renew contracts with the clients. And so what can Trump actually do if people are not following the executive orders? Like, he's not going to send people to prison over this, right? Like, he is probably going to take away funding from the institutions. And that's really where part of the question is. But I'll pass it over to Missy, because Missy also has a really great answer when it comes to legal avenues.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. And I'll just reiterate too, as we're thinking about responses, that there's no one perfect way to respond. What we put up here, all of these approaches are important because we need to work together as a collective. And we didn't forget the question about how to educate people on how DEI is not discriminatory, right? But that's part of the work, right? Part of the work is public action, and that can be, we're talking organizationally, but as an individual, there are things you can do as well. And public education and public action are things that are absolutely available to us, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. I think that if we're looking at, right, what if Trump doesn't follow the laws and decisions around DEI, right? What if this continues on in this kind of like flagged words version of what this reality is, where what was the word that I pointed out yesterday wasn't in there? Institution. The word institution is flagged. So I usually talk about coalition building, right? Just as with the responses to this anti-DEI movement, it will have some organizations that need to rebrand but continue doing the work, and we'll have some organizations that can move forward legal action to stop things that are happening, and we'll have some people that are taking different actions. We need to do the same thing if we're thinking about, if Trump stops following those judges' decisions, which is probable, right? You unmuted, Lucy. Do you want to add something before I continue on, or?
Oh, no, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just wanted to let people know, if they don't know what the flagged or banned, semi-banned words, it's the New York Times put out an article after they compiled a lot of documents from the Trump administration, emails and suggestions on how to respond, how to, comply with the executive orders. And there's a long list of flagged words that they recommend shouldn't use or should limit using. And yeah, in that it's institutions, as you said, Missy, and the ones you mentioned earlier, woman, Native American, but interestingly, man or white are not in there. So
Can you believe it? Can't
we
believe
can
it.
say the word man.
Okay, there are two more questions. I'll just throw them out there, and if you want to answer them now, you can, or if you want to kind of save them for later. And then there's a third comment in the chat that just has kind of some survey response data that would be worth looking at. The first question is, what are some ways university faculty and departments may be able to respond or push back if university administrators pre-comply with ambiguous advice? And the second, uh, thanks so much. Even if an organization doesn't have federal contracts, nonprofits and foundations and universities enjoy special tax status. If 501(c) gets taken away, that's the end for many of them. Shouldn't we be worried about that?
Yep.
Sorry, there's a few more. I'll get to those, but we'll just stop there for now and then get to the rest of the questions.
All right, we'll definitely get to the how can we educate people in ways that you can push back as faculty and admin. I'll talk a little bit about the tax status right now in responding to what to do, thinking about coalition building around Trump not right following the decisions by judges. So one of the major decisions that have already come down and is that in terms of private entities, many people here may have responded to the Citizens United decision that made corporations into people that have First Amendment rights, including the right of free speech. And that decision is what allows corporations to give money to political campaigns as free speech. I know there's a lot of conversation within anthropology about that. One of the strange upsides right now is that corporations have some cover when it comes to DEI because it is their First Amendment right to use DEI, right? DEI is not discriminatory according to the federal judgments, and it is their First Amendment right to say and use it. And that gives corporations some power right now, for better or for worse. So, right, if there are discriminatory federal laws or policies, if Trump, right, is actually going to move forward with this, then the first thing that we can do is rely on the states. And here, right, drawing from like the history of thinking about this is not the first time there have been federal policies that are extremely discriminatory, right? They persist. But there's a history of states fighting, right, federal discriminatory laws at the federal level. Most recently, in the early 2000s, right, the Defense of Marriage Act, right? So you have the Defense of Marriage Act that makes marriage equality impossible, right? Same gender marriage illegal. And Massachusetts says, no, I'm sorry, right? My state level constitution says that marriage equality, right, is important and it is part of the state law of Massachusetts. So state level action, there is a precedent for state level action to being used to push back against some federal policies that are problematic. State level actions in California right now are being used to shore up places where we might be losing federal funding or federal enforcement protections, such as around Title IX, right? So there are state level protections potentially, right? If you don't have state support, coalitions, right? That includes relying on for-profits, which is an unpopular position. However, think about how much they have in terms of their rights, right? And there is a history of for-profit corporations being used to advance policy and being able to provide cover at times when there was no state or federal or even a lot of nonprofit or labor support, such as in the LGBTQ plus movement. And so when I say coalitions, I also mean coalitions of for-profit, nonprofit, educational sectors coming together to try to create some strategies and cover. So I will pause there and see if Lucy wants to interject.
I wanted to add something to completely 100%. We are for coalition building. Part of my and Missy's work through Willing Observer has been on public education, like putting out the podcast, putting out writing. I'm guessing so many of you that are in the audience are great authors that can write, that can use your talents to do more public engagement. But getting back to the 501c3 question, there are a lot of things that we can be worried about. Like these executive orders are really vague on purpose, right? They want, like previously, before Missy and I have been talking about this for a long time, 2 years ago, DEI was a very limited type of work, right? It was like diversity management industry. It's a business management practice. It's like mostly in corporate space. And now with these executive orders, DEI work has become almost anything under the umbrella that pertains to people of color and women and other marginalized communities. Right. So that's why we're having this conversation, because even anthropology departments could be considered DEI work. And because anthropology is focused on cultural differences and appreciating and valuing cultural differences in, everyday life, in our work, in school, etc. So I don't want us to go into the panic mode because we think, oh, these executive orders can apply to anything and everything under the sun, therefore we're all doomed. Like, yes, we can go in that route. But if we take a step back a little bit and think, what is within my power of influence and my power that I can control, and what can I do strategically to continue doing this work? If we're concerned, for example, 501c3 is going away, under this administration, anything is possible. It's hard to imagine that situation because so many 501c3s are for advancing marginalized communities, empowerment, to address discrimination, systemic discrimination. That, because there's so many of them, there's so much power there. Right. So connecting with other 501c3s that are similar minded, looking at what kinds of political action, public action you can do. If you're uncomfortable allying yourself with corporations, how can you tap into those organizations? Like the AAUW is a 501c3 nonprofit that does a lot of political lobbying. They write legislation, like Missy writes legislation as her side job, side unpaid job. And so there is work that is getting done. So if that is your concern, like tap into those networks and see how you can support. And I think instead of I would be, optimistic that it's going to give you a little bit of hope to know that there are a lot of people actively challenging these executive orders so that we don't get there, right? So we don't end up getting 501c3s that are completely banned.
Yes, I agree. And, also when we're talking about coalition building for-profits, just to mention something that, that Lucy and I draw on and doing DEI work in for-profit and corporate spaces is that, and also one of the reasons that DEI has historically, right, been critiqued is that there is a business case to be made for DEI, which, is in tension with the kind of like humanitarian social justice work that are the outcomes or the potential outcomes. But in these moments, it is a good time to lean on the case that DEI, that diversity is good for organizations and for businesses. And in the for-profit sector, makes them more profitable and makes them more innovative and makes them more dynamic in a global market because the ends are important. And part of the ends in that coalition building is if you motivate an organization who has a lot of money and First Amendment rights to protect DEI, then you actually have a powerful ally in terms of moving forward and pushing back both politically and in, getting diverse folks into organizations to create change from the inside. And that is, right, part of our kind of advice for, creating change in that way. So just to make sure that we mark that there is a business case for DEI and that sometimes it may hurt our hearts to talk about it in that way, but it is useful strategically if you're trying to get some of this work done. Can I point to something else that's in the Q&A as well?
Missy, before you do that, can I say that a lot of the infrastructure for some major corporations already exists as advisory councils, and it's part of their DEI strategy. So if you want to do, like, I noticed what are some examples? If you want to look for some organizations that have advisory councils on DEI, you can even have people from your institution join them by establishing those connections. And you can probably just like Google the company name and if they have an advisory council. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, one of the comments in the chat, and I don't want to speak for this person, but they said that they do corporate advisory, right? They do that kind of research. And they're also talking about metrics, which is something that Lucy and I talk about a lot because as a bunch of folks on this call are probably trained in really strong research methods, not just research, but right, metrics, and being able to do qualitative metrics and mixed methods research. The comment in the chat says that they are basically like laser focused on metrics and data, and that is really important, especially if right you're trying to show that diversifying all these different organizations, whether for profit or nonprofit, is beneficial to the organization and to society more broadly than being able to actually right track with data-driven evidence is really important. So I just want to amplify that in the Q&A and thank that attendee for dropping that in.
We have another similar one. Sorry, Sean, we're like going through the Q&A, taking your job. So along that line is how do you prove that diversity is good for the bottom line for in profit? So I wanted to say a couple of things about that. One, I wanted to give you examples of how you can do that, but it's not just the bottom line for in profit. The business case, and I write about this, it's not just the business case for corporations, it's also what's the business case for your institution. What is the business case for your 501c3? That may or may not have to do with your increasing profit, right? That can be about achieving your mission and your vision and your goals. Like that's what it means to create a business strategy, is where DEI is tied to the main reason of being for your organization. And you have to have a strong case for it and then measure it and give concrete evidence that it does help advance the mission of your organization, whether that's to get more profit or whether that is to help, disenfranchised communities go vote, right? What is the metrics that you're using is defined by what are your goals. And so, for example, what is the business for a profit sector? I'm going to loop in another question on ERGs. So employee resource groups, which are based around many different things. It could be around identity of people. It can be around projects people are having. But so let's say you want to do an ERG, that's a diversity initiative. How is that going to advance your business goals? Let's say, for example, it's timely topic because I'm working on putting the deck for a training similar to that. But let's say you work at a gaming company, right? You're putting together a video game and you want to have a ERG that's about advancing women in gaming and video games. And let's say that ERG creates characters that the company can then incorporate into their video games. Can you track the kinds of work that the ERG is doing? How many of them actually make to the video games? What does that mean in terms of the revenue for that company? Because now they have video games where they have strong women lead characters, right? So you think about what are the outcomes of those DEI initiatives and how are they tied into what the company cares about, what your organization cares about, and then quantitatively track it. And also qualitatively track it. That's the one of the big reasons Missy and I started this work is because there is a lot of value on quantitative data in DEI, but there's a lot of qualitative data as well that can help show that DEI initiatives do create more belonging in an organization, and that more belonging, we know the research says, creates to higher retention, higher engagement, more creativity, more innovation. And so how do you prove that? I think a lot of us here on this call would have some ideas on how to put together a research project that really does provide evidence of that.
Yeah, and I'm going to take Sean's job too. Can we all just take Sean's job? I'm also going to move us to this slide as we're talking, because I think we're kind of talking about some of these resources as well. And then we'll go back to that last slide. But another question that I see in the chat is, what's an example of a for-profit corporation that would be interested in coalition building around DEI? And I think, Lucy, you've already kind of alluded to like this, talking about employee resource groups as having like institutional power. The ones that are beneficial to organizations have institutional power, let's put it that way. But other things to note about for-profit corporations are that they all have, or many of them, especially the big ones, are invested in either environmental, social and governance, right, international ESG metrics. Some of them that are multinational are guided by the UN metrics around this, and that's for international investing, because globally DEI is booming, right? The fact that there's pullback here, right, doesn't really acknowledge what's happening globally. And so knowing that those for-profits have these kinds of metrics that are really looking at what they're doing, not just for the environment and environmental justice, but around kind of internally and externally what the organization is doing for society. And I know that there's a sordid history of corporate social responsibility, so with full acknowledgement of that. But all of that to say, organizations are looking to partner with communities because they have it embedded in their ESG programming. And so coalition building with local groups is something that is pretty common for-profits. And on the political side, some for-profits do actually openly get involved in political activism. And this is something else that I write about in terms of, pushing back on the initial kind of bathroom bills in North Carolina. And then, Disney is not a perfect company, but they did, after their employee resource group, their LGBTQ plus employee resource group, was very angry about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. Disney pushed back against the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, around legislation and around the implementation of that legislation at the same time that legal action was ongoing. And they allied with LGBTQ plus organizations in order to make that work. So those are some examples, right? That's one example of a big for-profit, but know that even the little for-profits probably have a community outreach program of some sort, and are looking to partnership work as part of their ESG or allyship programming. Right. So pause. Sean, do you want to take your job back?
No, I'm happy to share the moderator duties. But I will say, there have been a ton of great questions. You've already been addressing, I think, the ones that are most pressing. But I'll just say that there's also a lot of great resources, examples that people are dropping in the Q&A. I saw an op-ed, I saw a link to New York Times articles. So make sure you're also looking at that. Because yeah, people are sharing their experiences, their ideas there too.
Fantastic. I think, maybe we can turn towards just some resources, and then we have kind of a call to action for you all, and we can touch on, I will look through the rest of the Q&A and see if there's anything else we want to touch on before we go there. But I want to pause and say, Lucy and Addie, do you want to take us in another direction, or do you want to move to kind of resources and calls?
I think that we're getting so much great information, so I will let you both take the lead.
I wanted to make a point here that I saw a few instances of like the merit question in DEI. And maybe this has to do with how higher ed is structured very differently than corporate spaces are structured. So in corporate world, there's very, very clean distinction, right, between affirmative action and diversity management. Those things are like separate departments, separate offices. Many organizations don't do affirmative action work. They only do DEI work. And so I just wanted to, for people who are confused about where is the line in those two concepts, Affirmative action is about compliance, right? You're complying with the federal government that you're not going to discriminate, and you're providing evidence to the government of what initiatives, policies, programs you have that correct for discrimination in your organization and generally. So it's based on specific protected categories. So race, gender, ethnicity. And veteran status, I believe, is one, and disability is another one that people track. When it comes to diversity management, diversity can mean anything from race, gender, to generational diversity, to personality differences, to differences in perspective. So the word diversity is a lot more broader. And it's about also making sure that that it's integrated in the corporation for business value. That means that diversity departments in organizations are not focused on discrimination. That's the HR world. That's the affirmative action world. They're focused on how can we make sure everyone feels like they belong. And that's not just discrimination. That's a lot of different things, right? Like using people's pronouns, for example. Using pronouns. If you don't use someone's pronouns, you're not necessarily discriminating, but it's a way to make someone feel like they can belong. So that pivot in really how do you engage with differences is really important to understand, because then you're not doing things like preferential treatment, or you're not just focusing initiatives on, for example, Black women in the organization, right? You're focusing on mentorship programs that benefit everyone, including Black women. And so I think it's important for people to understand that distinction, that previously, the Trump administration had been targeting, and the legislation had been targeting affirmative action kind of initiatives like race-conscious policies. But race-conscious policies are not part of DEI initiatives traditionally, especially not in the corporate world. And so what you do get, and what I would suggest, is for people that are scared and concerned that their initiatives might be seen as discriminatory, is to create more structure. Create more structure under your initiative. So if you have like a mentorship program, for example, have an application process. Have an application process that then seeks to, do like a blind resume type of thing where you don't discriminate. You can have that mentorship program be for advancing diversity. That's not against the law, but make sure that you are treating people fairly in those initiatives, and that you use things like diversity statements, if they're not currently outlawed, as per the slide that Missy showed, to show that there's many different ways to demonstrate the qualities you're looking for in a DEI initiative, that it's not about picking individuals because of their identity. And I know that's really hard, and that's why there's consultancy agencies for this, like Missy and I. But we have a lot of free resources, and we're happy to continue talking about how do you really tease that out and make a good DEI program or initiative.
Yeah, and I will say that there's also a lot of really good conversation about this out of admissions offices, because after the affirmative action decision came down, they also had to pivot, and so they've done a lot of work, and good admissions departments have done a lot of work to kind of pivot on how they talk about the incorporation of experiences and of differences of experience, without marking those experiences in a way that would draw the ire, right, of legal action. I could talk about Title IX all day. I won't, but please contact me if you want to talk to me about how Title IX has been used and litigated on college campuses right now. And I want to point to one other thing in the chat about Palestinian scholars and so I'm on a panel in 2 weeks, right, about the changing nature of discrimination. And I think that there's a lot of things that may be available to play with around the way that discrimination is given kind of legal cover under the First Amendment, under religious liberty, because that is shifting at the moment. And so I think that there is also a place to kind of, as the nature of discrimination legally is changing, I think that there's a lot of work that can be done there to create cover and to create at least a legal contest that would bolster protections for those scholars under a different part of the First Amendment, and that's under the Religious Liberty Clause, right, or the Free Exercise Clause. So we are being very, very kind of, right, we want to acknowledge the bad situations that people are in, but we want to also give you some hope for the different kinds of things that can be done, because feeling disempowered and feeling overwhelmed is part of the strategy. And please be sure to take care of yourselves, but also, think about what you can do yourself to take some sort of action, to ally with others, to use the power and privilege that you do have in some spaces to advance, because otherwise the overwhelm and the fear is the point. And I always think of it as, right, they are not winning. And so we also wanted to give you just kind of thinking about for yourself, right? What can you do personally, right? What can you do interpersonally within like the small teams of people that you work with or that you interact with? And what can you do in your department or in your organization? And these can be things as simple as like, if you're using inclusive language in your teams or with your students, then you are, pushing back in a small way that builds up collectively. And that is something that is empowering at the moment as we think about this coalition building for all these different kinds of structures and systems that we have to work together in order to bolster protections. Lucy, do you want to add anything?
Do you want to walk them through it? Do you want to give time to practice it?
We can give you time to practice. And then I should probably go to back to the resource page and explain it. And then we'll take any other kinds of questions. So this is something that we use also when we train allyship, and when we train lots of different things, because I think sometimes it becomes less tangible unless you can kind of really see what you can do at different levels. And so if you're thinking personally, actions that you can do individually to support and advocate for diversity, to prepare yourself to create things like inclusive interactions, to create more belonging, this means that at the personal level, you always can take action. You can learn more, you can upskill, you can pick a specific target area of something that you'll either have the biggest impact on, or right, that you need the most upskilling on. Choose that and then make a commitment to it and track yourself doing it. So practice asking and using right pronouns regularly, or simply change the way you interact with people and ask them what they would like to be called. Right. In a moment where not just LGBTQ plus rights, but trans rights in particular are under attack, right? This is a place where thinking about gender inclusive and gender neutral language is something that can be highly impactful. At the interpersonal level, right, this is actually putting that into practice. So things you can do to intervene or to change systems. I think about things in terms of communication a lot, because, linguistic anthropology, the small but mighty, right? So thinking about, right, how you can actually incorporate that, right? Learning how to intervene in situations where you see something like misgendering in a way that is useful, that changes systems, and that doesn't, right, center yourself. At the organizational level or the department level, right? Lucy talked about some of the things that you can do already for thinking about, right? Applications. If we're thinking about misgendering, or if we're thinking about trans rights or non-binary folks, hey, make all your documents for your department gender neutral, right? Use they, them, and make that part of your policy. It's an easy way to think about it. Lucy, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered it in terms of Metrics, we have a really good handout we put together if you want to use some handouts, if that's good. If you want to do this with people that you know, people that are in your team, when you're thinking about allyship in particular, there's so many things you can do. And I think a lot of the times we get overwhelmed by all the things we're doing and all the things we're not doing. So highly suggest just write down 3 things, like one at each level, that you're going to focus on from now until the end of 2025, for example, and then just do those and do those consistently. If you're thinking organizationally, you want to serve on an advisory group of a corporation or start building coalitions, then do your research. What is one contact that I can have that could connect my organization with their organization, and then go from there. And think about who are your allies in those spaces. And so, yeah, just like, it's a tough time to be doing this work. Missy and I have felt like we've been under the water hose for a long since Trump was elected. So really choose where you're going to put your energy. And it's easy to get scared. And as Missy said, that is part of the strategy, to get us scared and to get us immobilized and frozen to not do any work. But that is absolutely the wrong answer, right? Not doing the work and being scared and not doing anything is not the right answer if you really want to keep DEI as part of our core values and our core reasons for continuing to do this work, especially as anthropologists.
Yep. And so we put together a resource website for you, and a lot of our handouts are available on our main page. I believe that we're going to share these slides with all of you. And so you'll have the links that are in here, as well as the link to the resource page that'll send you to the Willing Observers homepage. And we have toolkits, and our free stuff is called Culture and DEI 101. And you'll find free stuff all over the place. If you want a specific resource, don't hesitate to email us. Here are some of the other resources. Keeping informed on the legal challenges always makes me feel good when I go to Lawfare ACLU and see how many legal challenges are happening. As a public policy director, this is the first year we're taking opposition stands to legislation that's being proposed in California. We're doing that through subcommittee hearings, through writing letters, and then the next thing through ResistBot, which is one of my favorites. It's a fantastic tool, and it's a place where you can write petitions. It connects you immediately with legislators. Issue-based action individually. This one is not ready to go, but I'm happy to share it. It's a Fighting Project 2025 action resources. It's in beta testing. If you want to check it out, send me an email. We talked a little bit about translating your work to the wider public. I know AAA had an op-ed project. I think you all still have an op-ed project coming up for this year. Right. It's a fantastic way to kind of upskill to translate that work. And then we have one last thing, and this is if you want to be part of kind of a network of people who do culture and DEIB, then you'll get this to fill out a form, and please join us so we can continue to connect with each other.
Oh, let me make a longer point for this one. Yes, Melissa Vogel, who is here in the chat. Yay, Melissa, thank you. We, with Melissa Vogel and Erica Vogel, have been building out the framework for this culture and belonging network. And what we are trying to do is get more people who are experts in culture, who are also experts in DEI, to be thought leaders, to collaborate on projects together, to share resources. And anyone else that wants to stay informed on this kind of to connect with each other generally, we've created this form. You can fill it out for whatever your interest might be, if you want to be a member, or if you just want to stay up to date on the work that anthropologists, culture experts are doing in DEI. That's a good way to stay connected.